Welcome to this introduction to culturally responsive and sustaining teaching in adult ESOL based on the Massachusetts Professional Standard Number 3. It is our hope that by watching this video, you will be able to answer the following questions. What is culturally responsive and sustaining teaching, or CRST, in both general terms and specifically in the context of adult ESOL? Why is CRST important for English learners? And begin to think about how you can create a culturally responsive and sustaining ESOL class for your adult learners. So let's jump right in by defining what we mean by CRST. Here is a definition by Geneva Gay, who originated the term around the year 2000. Culturally responsive teaching is using the cultural knowledge, prior experiences, frames of reference, and performance styles of ethnically diverse students to make learning encounters more relevant and effective for them. It teaches to and through the strengths of these students. The culturally sustaining part of CRST was added a few years later by Django Paris and Sami Alim. It is the idea that learners' languages and cultures need not be only respected and honored, but also actively supported and sustained by educators. Culturally responsive and sustaining teaching has the explicit goal of sustaining and supporting bi or multilingualism and culturalism. And so why is this important? Number one is that it works. The research shows that CRST is effective. Students, particularly racial, ethnic, and linguistic minorities, do better in school when the curriculum and instruction include and affirm their cultures and languages. Students show greater academic achievement and engagement. They develop critical consciousness or an awareness of inequities and of social justice. They gain a more positive view of themselves in terms of their ethnic and racial identities, and they gain a more positive view of others. Another reason that CRST is important is that it is an explicitly anti-racist approach to teaching. If we consider Ibram X. Kendi's definition of anti-racism, that it is a practice or policy that produces or sustains equity and actively breaks down racial hierarchies, then we can appreciate the anti-racist value of CRST. The focus of CRST over the past 2 decades has been primarily in the K-12 system and has been intentional about redressing the damaging effects of oppressive teaching on racial, ethnic, and linguistic minority K-12 students. But now let's look at what CRST means for adult English learners. The Mass ESOL Professional Standard on CRST explains it this way. It facilitates language learning. CRST promotes intercultural and global awareness among learners by contextualizing language skills and content that is relevant and meaningful, and by lowering the affective filter, which motivates students to come to class, participate, and learn. Further, CRST increases learners' awareness of U.S. culture and history, fosters critical thinking, encourages civic engagement, and enhances students' socio-political consciousness. CRST breaks down the hierarchy that has historically existed in the adult ESOL classroom, where the goal has been learners' integration and assimilation into the U.S. culture, along with learning English without necessarily considering the cultures and languages of the learners. In contrast, in a CRS adult ESOL classroom, learners' linguistic and cultural identities are valued, sustained, and leveraged for their learning. We've touched on what CRST is and why it is important. Now let's look at how you can create a culturally responsive and sustaining ESOL classroom. They create a classroom environment that is inclusive and equitable. They recognize students' linguistic and cultural identities as assets. They include diverse instructional content and materials reflective of their learners and beyond. They include high expectations of learners and engage them in critical thinking, particularly in areas around civic engagement and social justice. And finally, teachers challenge themselves to be more self aware of their own cultural biases and beliefs and how these might inform their teaching. Let's take a look at each of these elements more closely. First, how to create an inclusive and equitable learning environment. One simple but important thing teachers do is learn students' names and how to pronounce them correctly. This may seem like a small thing, but it goes a long way in helping students feel seen and included. Then go beyond their names and get to know your students as individuals. Learn about their interests, their identities, communities, current circumstances, or jobs. Build genuine relationships with them. You can do this through classroom activities or informal one on one conversations. Ask questions and show interest, and then go deeper by learning about their countries of origin, their other languages, their cultures. Learn about both the individual students and also about their cultures in general. Learn about Haitian history, Somali geography, Puerto Rican politics. Maybe learn some Arabic or Farsi. Visit the communities where your students live. And importantly, include aspects of your learners' cultures in the classroom. Invite them to share what they know and what they've learned. Consider simple things like room setup, the artwork, and include representations of your learners' cultures. Consider the atmosphere when class isn't in session and encourage socializing, perhaps with conversation starters or sharing snacks. As ESOL teachers, you probably do this to a certain extent, but through the CRST lens, it means being very intentional about creating classroom and school environment that is inclusive of all learners, welcoming and affirming, and that fosters feelings of student safety and belonging. In short, it's a classroom environment where students feel at home. It's also important to recognize students' cultures and identity as assets, strengths to be appreciated, honored, explored, and sustained in the classroom. It is especially important in a class where learning English and about U.S. culture is the goal that teachers don't allow the languages and cultures of their learners to get lost or subsumed due to the pressures to assimilate. For example, our learners are all, to varying degrees, bi or multilingual, and they benefit from being able to draw on their additional languages in class. Language learners engage in what is known as translanguaging, which is the integrated use of all languages they speak. CRS teachers dispense with an English-only rule in class and instead welcome learners to speak their languages when they need or want to translate instructions for a class activity so they can get to the activity, to access a complex text, to communicate ideas to classmates when working on a project, or to write a first draft. Similarly, CRS teachers affirm the value of their learners' multiculturalism and invite them to write or speak from their funds of knowledge and experience. CRNS teachers also highlight the positive aspects of their students' cultures. For example, a unit on Black history would include more than the history of slavery and racism and include the history of Black scientific discovery, legal scholarship, and creative invention from countries and cultures around the globe. A unit on Middle East might include the region's many lasting contributions to the world, such as the first writing system, codes of law, irrigation, among others. Students with these cultural identities benefit when they're recognized as assets, and the class community benefits from learning about them as well as recognizing them as assets. A culturally responsive and sustaining ESOL class also includes diverse perspectives and materials that go beyond learners' familiar sphere. They include materials representative of many cultures and created by authors from those cultures, including pictures and visual representations. They ask students for recommendations and input. They include perspectives of historically marginalized or underrepresented groups, English speakers with different accents. They share success stories of immigrants and people from other countries, particularly where the success includes an affirmation of the individual's culture. CRNS teachers include diverse perspectives of U.S. culture as well, so that students learn not only about the dominant culture, but also about the many cultures that make up the U.S. culture. This provides a more accurate picture of the diversity within U.S. culture and allows learners to see themselves as a part of it. Another key element of CRST is academic achievement, where learners engage in higher order thinking and develop socio-political consciousness. CRNS teachers hold high expectations of their learners. They believe that all students can succeed, and they challenge any misconceptions students might have about their own abilities. They encourage learners to embrace productive struggle and risk taking as opportunities for learning and success. CRS teachers engage learners in complex ideas, complex texts, and complex language, calling on them to analyze, synthesize, and evaluate information, and formulate, organize, and articulate their own ideas. And just as importantly, they provide the support learners need to accomplish these complex tasks. Understanding and communicating complex ideas requires complex language, like nuanced vocabulary, grammar, and discourse patterns. So, CRST in the ESOL classroom must include language instruction, practice, and scaffolding, along with higher order thinking skill development. A CR&S class includes rich conversations about real issues. When culture is discussed, for example, it goes beyond surface features like food, dress, and holidays into deeper cultural issues of values, notions of fairness, and individuality. When learning about U.S. culture and history, CRS teachers include materials and discussions about power and privilege, systems of oppression, equity, representation, and discrimination. CRNS teachers become skilled at facilitating these complex, sometimes difficult conversations. They know that these conversations are necessary for adult English learners and immigrants to navigate systems of power in their own lives and to become agents of change in their communities. In this way, CRST encourages civic engagement and enhances learners' socio-political consciousness. The last piece of the CRST pie is focused on teachers' own self-awareness and professional and personal development. In order to teach in a culturally responsive and sustaining way, teachers commit to critically assessing how their own cultures, assumptions, and beliefs affect their worldview and approach to teaching. They're open to looking at areas of potential implicit bias in themselves that might influence their instruction or interaction with students, and they commit to doing something about them. They are transparent about their teaching choices and welcome input from students, rather than assume their own culturally informed values automatically prevail in class. They look critically at any power differential between themselves and their students and identify effective strategies to mitigate its effects on classroom dynamics. For example, they may invite the class community to decide on class rules or discussion topics rather than decide unilaterally. And they pursue professional and personal development on how to be a more effective, culturally responsive, and sustaining teacher and apply their learning into practice. They regularly reflect and welcome feedback from students and colleagues. CRST is not simply a set of teaching strategies or a sprinkling of cultural references into the classroom. It is an educational philosophy that calls for all of these elements: critical self-awareness, honoring, evaluating, and celebrating the richness of students' diverse backgrounds, identities, strengths, and challenges within an inclusive, equitable learning environment that has high academic achievement as its goal. These features of CRST are not linear. That's why they're represented here in a circle. Becoming a culturally responsive and sustaining ESOL teacher is an ongoing process through which we learn and apply what we learn, making mistakes, reflecting, and learning more. As Maya Angelou said, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. And on that note, we encourage you to explore CRST further. We've included several resources at the end of this presentation, as well as a link to the SABE's website where you can find related professional development opportunities. Thank you so much for joining us.